Hello class, this is going to be a demonstration for our exercise 1 and exercise 2. Exercise 1 or assignment 1 is going to be a 5-step value scale, and exercise 2 is going to be another 5-step scale where we're going to be working with tints and shades. So just real quick, here I have my disposable palette, my Mars black and my titanium white, which I already have here on my palette, already not mixed, but I have them set up. We are going to be using more white than black in this exercise because black has a higher tinting strength than white. So whenever we're mixing our values, we'll start off with our white, and when we're working in that value scale, we're going to gradually add more black until we're able to create this kind of gradation of grays, increasingly darker grays, until we get to a black in our top section here. And right now we're kind of set up upside down, but whenever I start demonstrating, I'll show you more or less how that's going to start to look, right? So on this value scale, it's going to be pretty simple because we're working from one extreme to the next. So we're working from white to black with some increasing grays in between to create that value range. So the very first circle down here at the bottom here is going to be white, and then our very last circle at the top is going to be black. So those are already going to be the colors straight out of the tube. So we're really only mixing 3 grays today. In exercise 2, we're going to be mixing tints and shades. So we're going to start off with our base color. In this case, I'm going to use my red, and then one step above it, I'm going to go into my tints. So I'm going to add just a little bit of white to my red to kind of get a pinkish color. And then my last square on that tint is going to be mostly white with just a touch of red in there. So you kind of want to see that gradation happening. Also, we want to see that color becoming more and more desaturated. So when we're working on these top 2 squares, we're going to do the same thing but with black, right? So we're going to start off with our base red in the middle, and then our next square here is going to be our red with its a touch of black. And then as we go to our last square, it's going to be a very warm reddish black, right? We want it to be almost kind of more black than red at this point. So we do kind of want to create, again, that step gradation from our red to a darker red to a nearly black red here, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and work on these, and then I'll come back and I'll come back about halfway through to show you guys what it looks like, so that we know if we're progressing the way we should be, right? So let's go ahead and get started. We'll get started with the value scale for exercise 1 or assignment 1, and then we'll jump into our tints and shades for our second assignment. Okay, so here on my palette, I've mixed up my first gray. So as you can see, kind of on that bead of black ink, I have just a touch of that white. It's because I touched into it with my brush and just kind of got a little corner of it, and I mixed that black into my white to create my first step in the value scale. I did mix a lot of that first base gray, and the reason I mixed so much of that base gray is because we're going to be adding more paint to that. We're going to be adding a little bit more black to it as we move up our value scale. So if we have a large kind of pot from the beginning, we don't have to kind of go back into that white bead and then keep on mixing more black into it. It's easier to kind of build up from the grays that we've established, and that way we can kind of see the transition as we mix. And we know that the next color that we mix is going to be darker than the gray that we already have, right? So I'm going to go ahead and mix. I'm going to drop that into the second circle, and then I'm going to mix my third gray, right? So like I said, we have basically just 3 circles in between our perfect white and our perfect black. So we kind of have to make these transitions look a little bit more drastic than we traditionally would. But then by the time we're done with our value scales, we'll see that full range kind of create like a more believable transition from one value to the next, right? So it's going to look a little drastic in the beginning, but at the very end, we want to see a believable transition between this white and this black, right? So let's go ahead and mix the second color. So here we have our second value mixed up, and if you guys can look back over at the value scale, I have my second gray dropped in there, so we can already see the transition starting to happen between our white paint and then now our second step in our value scale, are kind of more of a very light gray. As we move into that that third circle, we are going to be working kind of like with the medium gray. So the gray that we mix should be kind of similar to the palette that we're working on. If you guys are working on a tone palette, it should be close to kind of that medium gray, right? So just kind of keep an eye on that. And when we do paint our circles in, make sure that you have enough paint on your brush, that we are painting these as opaque as possible, so that there's not really a lot of that white canvas showing through. Okay, so here I've actually mixed my fourth and fifth values. The fifth value, like I said before, is going to be our full just kind of Mars black straight out of the tube, and then the fourth value was just one step below that. So I said before that we want to create a believable transition. I think in my fourth value I got a little too dark, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until that dries, and then I'm going to come back and paint over it just so that that transition is a little bit smoother. But that's our first assignment, is going to be that value scale. In the next little section here, we're going to jump into working with tints and shades. So again, that's just going to be our base color, and then we're going to add white or black to it. Okay, so now that we're done with our value scales, we're going to jump into our tints and shades. I have my red out, and then I have a tiny bit of black, and then some more white. I still have some more white on that palette over there. So I could probably still use that bit, but just in case, I have that other white for backup. It is important to kind of measure. You'll get used to this more later on, but just kind of be aware of how much color you feel you're gonna need. And if you overmix a color, that's when having that palette with the lid on it really does kind of help extend the life of your paint. Being that this is acrylic paint, it is water-based, so whenever it evaporates, that's how the paint dries so fast, right? Acrylic paint dries through evaporation. Oil paint dries through oxidation, which takes a lot longer, up to 3 or 4 days. When we're talking about acrylic, we're working within a time span of minutes. So if the layer is thin enough, we could dry anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes, right? So just kind of be aware of that whenever we're mixing. It will kind of develop a skin, but it might stay wet underneath for a little while. So just there's still an opportunity to kind of save that. But again, putting it inside that covered palette will extend the life of it, because we're reducing how much airflow is going over our paint, and we can keep it wetter for longer, right? So if you overmix a color, it'd be a good idea if you had plans for it, right? So if you're finishing up your value scales, or you're finishing up your tints and shades, and we're about to jump into our alla primas, that might be an opportunity for you to kind of stop and think and say, okay, well, when I do my alla primas, am I going to use the color from my tints and shades in my alla prima? And if not, maybe just kind of make that adjustment from the beginning and kind of think about what you'd like to paint, and then we'll jump in and start using that same color. Our first alla primas are going to be monochromatic, which means they're going to be working with one color and then the tints and shades of that color. So whatever color you'd like to use in your alla primas, that could be an opportunity for you to kind of save on paint. So we're not mixing more than we need in that situation, right? So make sure we're watching this video first before we jump into our alla primas, and this will make a lot more sense then, right? We have that insider tip to kind of work from. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start off in this middle square, and I'm going to paint in my base red, which is my primary red that I have here on the left. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll jump into our tints first and then work into our shades, right? So again, like I said before, we're going to be working on our tints going upwards, and then we're going to be working on our shades going downwards. So this is going to be our base red. Red plus 1 is going to be basically like a pink, and then our red plus white 2 is going to be kind of like a more white than red, really, right? It's going to be a really kind of a pale pink. And then whenever we're working downwards, we're going to have a darker red in here, and then by the time we get to our bottom square here, it'll be more black than red, but it will look like a warmer black, which is what we call a tonal black, right? So it'll have kind of like a color temperature to it, and that could be something that we use to our advantage later on in the future. Whenever we do see warmer blacks, then we know that we can add some color to them to kind of tone them up a little bit and make them look a little bit more natural instead of like a flat graphic black out of the tube. Okay, so here we have our red plus a little bit of white. So whenever I mixed that color, what I did, because red has a very high tinting strength, is I actually started off with my white, and then I added a little bit of red to it, right, to kind of get it to shift, and then adding a little bit more paint, a little bit more of that that red to the white to make it turn into the pink that we see in front of us. If we start with our red paint and then we add white to it, it's going to take us a really long time to get it to be pink, and it's going to take a lot of white paint. White paint is one of the paints that we use the most, and a lot of times the reason why it comes in the bigger tube is because we end up using a whole lot of it. So if you want to make your white go for longer, try mixing your color into your white versus white into your color. Otherwise you're going to waste a lot of white paint trying to get that color to shift. So just kind of keep an eye on that. So whenever I'm going to be mixing that last square on my tint side, what I'm going to do again is I'm going to take that pink that I have and I'm going to mix it into that white that I have here on the bottom half of my palette here, so that I save on my white paint and I can create that transition faster, right? So when we're talking about tinting strengths, again, we're talking about how strong a color is and how easily it can shift other colors. So in terms of what we have in front of us, our black is going to have a really high tinting strength and a higher tinting strength than that red. So a little bit of black can shift our white really quickly, and a little bit of black is going to shift our red very quickly also. So just kind of keep an eye on that. Again, as we kind of get used to these quantities that we're using, just kind of be aware of tinting strengths going forward, and that's going to be something that we kind of keep coming back to, right? Is how strong is the color's tinting strength, and how much color do we need to mix in order to create the colors that we want, right? And which color do we mix into which, light into dark or dark into light. Okay, and then now we have our final tint, which is mostly white with really just a kind of a touch of that pink mixed in. So if you look at it, it just kind of looks like a slightly warmer white. What will happen with these acrylics is as they dry, they are gonna basically get a little bit darker. So if you over mixed it with that pink and it looks like it's mostly white, just kind of give it some time to dry and see if you see that color shift a tiny bit. And likely you will, and if you don't, once it is dry, you can come back in and paint back over it just to kind of get that practice in, and to make sure that we are kind of creating these tonal whites also, right? So now we're going to jump into our shades. So we're going to move in the other direction. So from the center up, we were trying to get brighter, and now from the center down, we're going to try to get increasingly darker, right? So our first step is again going to be a dark red, and then our last step is going to be mostly black, but with that kind of reddish kind of push to it, right? It's going to be a little bit warmer. And as I mentioned before, we do want to keep in mind the tinting strength of each of these colors. Since our black does have a higher tinting strength than our red, we want to start off with our big red pile there, and then we're going to add in a tiny bit of black to start to shift that red a little bit, and then always start out with a little bit first, just to kind of see how much that black will shift that color in the beginning, right? So what we want to avoid is a situation where we go too dark too fast, and then we have to use a ton of red or a ton of whatever color you're mixing the black into to kind of work your way backwards. It's always easier to start with a little bit and then kind of increase gradually so that we can create that shift kind of moving forward, right? So we can always add color, we can never really take it back, right? So just kind of keep that at the kind of front of mind. One thing I forgot to mention is that we want to be cleaning our brushes in between these stages. So whenever we're finishing up with our tints and we're moving into our shades, we don't want to have any white residual paint on our paintbrush. So having a little cup of water, here's mine here, handy in between our stages is going to be super important so that we don't contaminate our colors moving forward. So just a kind of a word to the wise to keep that water handy. I also have a paper towel here off to the side that I'm using to clean my brush. Kind of messy, but it gets the job done. And again, because we are working with acrylic and it is water soluble, the cleanup is a lot easier than if we were working with oil, right? And then a little more health conscious because we're not working with chemicals. Okay, so now we have our second red dropped in, so you guys can see the value shift there quite visibly. That was the red with just a tiny bit of black into it. You can see it there on my palette. I did get a little wild with it. So you just kind of know that's part of the process, right? Some people mix paints really neatly. I don't. So just don't judge me too much. But on the palette here, we can see again the transition. It almost kind of starts to look something like our value scales, where we are kind of moving again from that light to dark. And the nice thing about having our value scales next to our tints and shades is that we can kind of see how colors themselves also have their kind of inherent values, right? So that red kind of being in the middle could represent that medium gray, but if we were to take this into like a black and white shooting mode, we can kind of see what red's kind of base value is, and then see if it matches kind of like that middle gray, right? So we'll get into that a little bit later on when we start talking about local value. But I already have my darkest red already mixed. So if you guys can take a look over on the left here to my palette, we can see how it starts to kind of look like a very rich brown. So again, that's taking away that kind of graphic, super dark black quality from the Mars black, and then kind of starting to shift it a little bit more into that warm color range. So that makes that black look a little bit more natural whenever we lay it down, right? And then we are working on a toned, kind of like a medium gray palette. So whenever we shift that black onto that white, the contrast between that white background and that really dark red is going to be a little bit more pronounced than what we're seeing here on the palette. So kind of keep that in mind if you are working with a tone palette. A tone palette is kind of meant to show you the purity of a color and kind of its natural state. And then seeing it on that white background typically tends to give us a higher contrast or a higher kind of saturated look. So working on a tone background is helpful whenever we're mixing. If you guys also notice here on the paper again, I do have some tape set up just to kind of keep it a little bit neater. Whenever we are prepping our alla primas, we're going to be doing the same thing. We're going to be drawing out like a rectangle or for kind of our working space, and then having a taped edge will kind of keep those things looking sharp and give us a little border. If you guys like to work to the edge of your canvases, that's fine too. This is just something that I do to keep these exercises looking neat, right? So it's kind of like what they don't show you in the baking shows, right? This kind of in-between processes that make things look neater and cleaner. And that's a wrap on our value scales and our tints and shades. This was exercise 1 and 2, or assignments 1 and 2. So we're gonna let that dry. Should be dry to the touch in about 10 to 15 minutes. Probably our value scale is still a tiny bit wet, but I would recommend tearing those sheets out and setting them off to the side and letting them air dry. Definitely by the end of the day, they'll be dry. And the thing you'll notice with acrylic is that it will kind of have that sheen to it a little bit. It is kind of like a liquid plastic, so that's one kind of surface that you can expect with acrylic, is that kind of sheen. So just kind of as we're working with these things, kind of get a feel for what the material does and how it looks and how it might affect your painting in the future. Another thing is going to be cleanup. I'm actually going to jump right into my alla prima here, so I'm probably going to still utilize a lot of the paint that I have left on my palette. So look for the alla prima to be again monochromatic with some of these tints and shades kind of going on. So we'll jump into the alla prima demonstration next. If you guys were gonna wrap at this point, again, you'd want to take your brush, clean off the excess paint with a paper towel first, and then go into your water so that you can clean off the excess paint. And with acrylic paint, it can really gum up your bristles, so make sure that, again, when you're rinsing it, if you want to dump out the dirty water and then get some clean water and then hit it again a second time, just keep going until your brush is clean. And you can always test that on a paper towel. Whenever you run your bristles through the paper towel, you can always kind of see if there's any dirty water still in there. So we don't want to get our brushes really stiff and ruined. So making sure that we clean our brushes at the end of this process is going to be key in extending the life of our brushes. Especially with these synthetic brushes, they can take a beating. But if acrylic paint dries on the brush itself, there's not really too much that we can do other than get a new brush, right? So keep an eye out for that. And that was our exercises 1 and 2.